Friends, tonight we're building the Panzer of the Lake. This is the best Panzer IV I could find, and luckily we'll need just the turret because this kit contains like 5,000 or even slightly more parts. I also bought this evolution figure, and I know it's not a great representation of the real soldier from the photo, but I think it fits the scene pretty well. I mean, just look at his pose. Panzer of the Lake, what is thine wisdom? Build those models, don't just collect them. Oh, okay. And I think I should listen to him as well, so let's get this party started. This Hobby Boss kit is actually a reboxed 3-star Panzer IV, and these models were famous for their insane number of parts. To be honest, building a commander's cupola out of 17 parts instead of like 5 with the same amount of detail is not a definition of fun for me. So I was really glad I only had to assemble the turret and a little bit of the upper hull. In this specific case, the kit actually requires bending a plastic part. That's something I see all the time with photo edge, but never with plastic. I mean, yeah, it's not the type of build I'd enjoy. I kept the improvements to a minimum because there's not a lot of detail to improve in the first place. Just some replacement grab handles from a bent wire, that's something I do on all my models, and some quick improved weld detail. The welds in the kit are actually pretty nice, but because we have to glue the turret from several armor plates, a few tiny gaps will be visible, and I just found it easier to rescribe them and add new ones rather than trying to fill and sand those tiny gaps. Because I'm running low on Tamiya Epoxy Putty quick type, I tried sculpting them from green stuff. This putty is much softer and stickier, and the application wasn't as easy as I'm used to. However, sculpting the weld texture is much easier, especially if you want to make some of those messy multiple pass weld beads. Maybe I'll give this putty another try because it has some potential, but at least for now I think it's best for sculpting tarps and modifying figures. At this point I noticed that I used the wrong gun mantlet, and fixing my mistake meant cutting off the entire front plate, and then reapplying the welds and everything. Yep. Also, the cupola is built from almost 20 parts, but ironically, there's no interior detail. So I had to make my own, very simplified periscopes on a 3D printer. Are they accurate? Absolutely not. Are they better than no periscopes at all? Absolutely yes. Anyway, I assembled a part of the upper hull so I could cut it in half. I already did an extensive surgery on a Mark IV from Tamiya, which makes me pretty much an expert in cutting models in half. I used my phone as a guide for the pen, and the angle of the partially assembled hull was just what I was looking for. The surgery went pretty smoothly, and most of the stuff I added to the hull got destroyed anyway. It's moments like this when I wonder how satisfying and professional looking it would be to cut a fully assembled model in half with a high pressure stream of cutting water. But if destroying models is not your daily bread, then a less sophisticated way is the only option. Because the resulting hull was so small, I was able to easily level out any imperfections in the cut on a large sheet of coarse sandpaper. This procedure takes a while, but it's totally worth the good feeling and satisfaction. The last faux pas were the openings in the turret ring. They're probably a part of every tank model ever made, and I hid them under a strategically placed ammo canister and a tarp. I know, I'm lubricated as a fox. Up next is the resin figure from Evolution Miniatures. This is my second figure from this company, and once again I'm pleasantly surprised with its quality, also the amount of detail, and interesting, diorama-friendly pose, so to say. The only problematic part was the neck, so I did some filling and sculpting with the green stuff putty. As I said just moments ago, it's the best putty for stowage and figures. And because we have the tank and figure assembled, we can now construct the diorama. Here's a simplified layout based on the historical picture. This helped me to figure out how large the base should be, and once again, I opted for an oval shape because it's more compact and aesthetically pleasing than a rectangle. Just as with my IS-2 diorama, I drew the shape on the kit box using a compass, cut it out as smoothly as possible, and smoothened it out with a sanding sponge. Double-sided tape is a very strong and handy tool for dioramas, as you'll see in a moment, and as a small bonus, the box art will be decorating the bottom of the scene. Pretty cool and totally unintended detail. The entire point of that cardboard oval is that the foam cutter isn't hot enough to burn through it, so it acts as a perfect cutting template. Sure, some hiccups might occur from time to time, but these will be easily hidden. Once I had the oval, I cut it horizontally so the base won't become overly tall. And as a practical bonus, I can use the excess material to build the riverbank. So here's our initial 2D mockup converted into 3 dimensions, and just by looking at it, I think we're on a pretty good track. The riverbank was carved with hobby blade, and as you can imagine, this is much easier to do when it's a separate piece, but when you have multiple pieces of foam, they don't always have to fit together perfectly, right? Well, that's the advantage here, because it comes from the same block, and the kinks in the cut act like guidelines for that perfect, seamless fit. Now I could laminate the sides, and this time I made a paper template. When you're working with wooden veneer, one disadvantage is just the amount of waste, and this material ain't cheap, so that hurts a little every time. So using a paper template can save you some money, as you'll be cutting just what you need and nothing more. As I mentioned, the double-sided tape is amazing, and I was blown away by how easy it is to laminate the base. Using PVA glue and super glue and whatnot made the process feel like a struggle, but this is quick, easy and with instant results. Although I did secure the veneer with a bit of super glue, the tape seems strong enough as it is. I removed the excess wood with scissors, but I still kept a little extra because of the upcoming groundwork. The fake river bottom was made from lightweight acrylic putty. I spread it out with a spatula, trying to be as smooth as possible, although none of this will be visible in the end. It does a pretty good job protecting the styrofoam from epoxy resin, and it's pretty soft, so I can impress the tank, marking its forever resting spot in the river. I decided to make the riverbank eroded, and for the upper carpet, so to say, made out of dirt, roots and grass, I used a thin sheet of styrofoam. Of course, I had a bunch of reference images at hand while doing this. The foam was pretty weak, so I tried to reinforce it with a coat of AK's acrylic diorama texture. This has definitely done its job, but it also led to yet another benefit. You see, Smart Mud clay from VMS is amazing. It's hands down the best terrain sculpting material I've ever used, but it really sucks at sticking to smooth surfaces. I always have to work it really hard into the foam, and it takes a few minutes to get the nice, even coverage. However, the AK paste contains small stones, and these act as anchor points for the clay, making the application infinitely easier. And because the clay is so amazing for sculpting stuff, I added the rotted texture with the paintbrush. It looks quite exciting already, and this is just the first step where I'd used a regular air drying clay in the past. Although the clay itself is sweet, I find its texture a bit sandy, as in lots of fine grain but nothing more chunky. So I did my usual sprinkling of real earth from my garden, trademark, over a surface pre-moistened with diluted PVA glue. This is also a good time to press the figure into the ground so he won't levitate. A more careful approach was needed on the bank, as I didn't want to fill and hide the previously sculpted ruts. But also, I did some sculpting here as well, because larger stones and clumps of earth would naturally fall down. It's a pretty interesting terrain formation and a pretty eye-catching detail in a diorama. Moving on, I added the typical roots hanging down into the water. I saw this effect once in a diorama from Mick Jimenez, and I thought it's only possible in a rainforest or somewhere, but reference photos once again proved me wrong. As it turns out, the ground is a dense network of root systems, even if it's just covered in grass. Now that I mentioned grass, I once again tried to replicate what I saw in a reference photo. I added a small dirt trail, and there was a lot of dry, trampled grass around it, but almost none in the center. This is the usual dry seagrass from AK and a quick fix with diluted PVA. Living grass was added the usual way with a static grass applicator. I chose the shortest one I could find in my supplies because the shorter it is, the better it falls through the applicator mesh, and thus the better it looks. Just a small word of advice here: if you're applying static grass, it's better to let the groundwork dry completely, because mine was slightly moist from the diluted PVA, and it was kinda hard to remove the excess. I had to blow it off with an airbrush, but ultimately everything turned out alright. I also added a few tufts of longer grass here and there, and I find these more controllable if they're applied with tweezers and then, if needed, slightly trimmed down with a pair of scissors. Sweet! So now we have the construction phase finished, and we can move slightly to the right to my painting workbench. And we'll take it one component at a time, alright? So we'll start with the tank, then paint the ground and add water and finish with the figure. In the most unforeseen betrayal in modeling history ever, I sprayed the model with black primer. This came in pretty handy inside of the turret because it's pretty barren except for the gun breech, and also black works pretty well with Panzer Grey. The main coat was Tamiya's German Grey with about 25% of gloss varnish. I sprayed it over the entire model in a pretty much even opaque layer, mainly because there are not many places where I need artificial shadows except the aforementioned interior of the turret. Post shading was done by adding white into the previous mix. Because I wanted to be efficient, I mixed each layer directly in my airbrush. Just dip a large brush into the white paint, unload it into the airbrush, stir, blow some air bubbles into the cup, and you're ready to go. This way I added two main layers of highlights, with the final coat being limited to the smallest details such as the small hatch on the roof, the top of the gun barrel, and so on. I also outlined the details with an ammo shader, but because I sometimes suck really hard at filming, I didn't get a good angle. But you get the idea: spray it over every bolt, panel line, and you're done. With the base coat out of the way, I sprayed the model with a thick, generous coat of VMS flat varnish so the model would contrast with the water and it wouldn't give us any weird reflections. Moving on at light speed, I proceeded to outline every detail with a pin wash. I went with Winter Streaking Grime from AK because of its dirty color. Well, yeah, basically I could use this step to make the model crispier, but also add some initial weathering and give the cold Panzer Grey a warmer hue. The flat varnish usually makes blending a bit difficult because it absorbs the paint, but this can be used to our great advantage, because yes, it might make blending harder, but it makes adding dirt passes a lot easier. Also, it was nice to get this model to the stage in... I don't even know how long it took, but it felt like pretty quick. Next step, sponge chipping. I chose a very light grey acrylic paint and went over the entire model with a piece of torn sponge. I didn't want to add too many chipping effects on this one because on one hand I felt like tanks in 1941 would be rather fresh, but also, and this is a more serious reason, I just didn't feel like investing hours into a model that's basically gonna be a small prop in a diorama. And because I already had the paint at hand, I grabbed a small paintbrush and picked out every small bolt on the tank. This is a very simple, stylistic, but powerful technique because it makes the model look more detailed and lighter, so to say. The details are all there, right? But when they're highlighted in this fashion, they become more noticeable. Dark steel chipping was painted with a pointy 000 paintbrush. I went with my favorite chipping color, dark rust from Vallejo's Panther Aces range, and here I'd like to mention one thing. My airbrushing leaves a lot to be desired, and it's in these close-up shots where you can often notice some imperfections like dust particles and other stuff in the paintwork. Well, instead of trying to remove those, I simply use them as a guide for chipping. Is there a small grain of dust on the surface? Or is there some tiny orange peel texture somewhere? Well, I paint a chip over it. So yeah, sponge chipping, my not perfect airbrushing, exposed edges, and high traffic areas are all opportunities for some sweet chipping effects. Rust zones are at that point where I try to distinguish the hull from the turret. The entire hull will be flooded and only the turret will be sticking out of the water, so it led me to think about how it would affect the weathering on the tank. To enhance this look, I applied the rust in very heavy amounts on the hull while keeping it restrained on the turret. Basically, the turret received the usual rust treatment as I normally do on all my models, and the hull was turned into a small rust bucket. I talked before about how blending rust zones over Panzer Grey is tricky because rust combined with a grey undercoat is a great combination for exposed rusty metal, but in this case it made the job easier because a rusty Panzer IV was exactly what I was aiming for. There were a few details that had to be painted, and I base coated all of them in black-brown. This method helps to make them look sharper thanks to the high contrast it provides. I started using it on figures and then transferred the technique to armor models when I'm painting stowage and stuff. Oh, and by the way, these ropes were made from twisted wire. Okay, now I need to place the model in the diorama because the flowing river would most likely affect the weathering. Basically, I felt like there will be a lot of debris on the tank because when there is a lot of rain and the water level increases, creeks and rivers turn muddy, or at least that's the case in my area, and all this mud and debris would get caught on one side of the tank. So it was basically the same technique as usual, fixing real earth, dry grass and leaf scatter with VMS ballast freeze. But the amount and the way it was applied made it into a whole new experience. This was followed by some very subtle pre-dusting with Tamiya's buff paint, but only on the turret because if the hull is underwater, there shouldn't be any dry earth tones and dust effects. The hull was weathered completely with dark tones. The main color was earth from ammo, and I applied it in very generous amounts over pretty much everything, but of course mainly around the piles of dirt. This blended the real earth pretty nicely with the rest of the tank. To add some contrast, I applied winter streaking rime as a pin wash of sorts, adding some shadows and depth to the piles of mud and debris. All the while the previous paint was still kinda fresh, so they would slightly melt into each other. So that's the finished Panzer of the Lake, ready to be integrated into the diorama. It took me roughly 2 days to finish it, and it felt pretty good, let me tell you. Maybe I should cut every 1/35th model in half so I can finish them faster. Anyway, moving on. My usual approach with dioramas is to prime everything black and then paint everything, right? Well, after my last experience with a raw, unpainted forest floor, I was tempted to not paint everything. But it took me a while to figure out the best approach, and I'll let you to be the judge. Basically, I primed the river floor and the grass with the dark brown primer. The river makes sense, but the grass doesn't. However, I just don't like how the static grass looks when it's not painted, so there's that. I talk about that every time I do this, and basically my approach is to really flood the grass with a dark primer so it reaches all the way to the bottom, and then spray and post-shade it with various dry and fresh tones, making it look denser and livelier. Also, it's a great way of integrating foliage into the ground, because you can add various subtle dust colors to make the transition between dirt and grass more subtle. So that's the primed and painted grass, but what about the ground? Here I decided to keep it raw, but improve it slightly with paint. Using buff from Tamiya again, I sprayed it on the trail in uneven coats and on the bank from above, highlighting its texture. It was so simple and the result was so good that I felt like the ground doesn't really need any additional effects. So I quickly sprayed the bottom with a khaki color, as I find it rather fitting, yet it's not too dark. It actually has a noticeable impact on how the epoxy water turns out, so yeah, there's that. Okay, here are the base colors. Let me know your thoughts about the partially painted groundwork. I think the results are pretty sweet and almost effortless. The next step was preparing the river and gluing the tank in place. I added a generous layer of still water from AK and spread it under the tank. This will act as a layer of waterproofing and also as glue for the tank. The last time I did this was with the Mark IV diorama, and the line around the tank remained visible even after I poured 2 layers of resin. So to make the tank as integrated into the scene as possible, I added small amounts of fine dirt all around it, using it basically as a filler. And I gave that another coat of khaki so it would blend in with the fake bottom. Sometimes you just have to use dirty tricks when you're making dioramas, you know? And with that being done, I could tape the base. I've been using Tamiya masking tape on all my epoxy dioramas and it works really well. Quick, simple, and it gets the job done. It just tends to make some funny shapes here and there, so I like to reinforce it with a thick, double-sided tape. Continuing where we left off moments ago, I flooded the rest of the river with still water. I like to use it as a barrier between styrofoam and epoxy resin. You know, it saturates the porous surface, preventing leaks and the formation of air bubbles. It also dries pretty fast, but I noticed this weird cracked formation near the bank. I mean, it happened in my IS-2 diorama as well, so I guess it just happens sometimes, and I'm sure it won't cause any problems at all. Water will be once again made from AK's epoxy resin. I just like how user-friendly it is. They give you syringes so you can prepare the exact amount you need, and it's also easy to measure with the required 2:1 ratio. I went with a total volume of 60 milliliters, so 40 milliliters of resin and 20 milliliters of hardener. The first layer had to be quite opaque so it would hide the tank sitting on the fake bottom, but also translucent enough so it wouldn't look artificial. Well, I went with 7 drops of khaki drab for this large volume. Practice proves my theory almost immediately because, unlike the last pour, the color of the bottom is still visible here. This pour was pretty easy because I knew the hull would be completely flooded, so I didn't have to constantly check if the resin is gonna touch something that shouldn't be touched. I just had to keep in mind the hatches and the inside of the turret because that would look pretty odd. The 60 ml volume was enough to cover the entire river all the way up to the roof of the hull. I know, pretty sweet. I just helped the resin to crawl up the hull a little, as this would make the second pour much easier, and also this layer would spread out more evenly. Then it was time to burst air bubbles with a blowtorch. This is always a super duper stormtrooper satisfying process, and I love observing how the resin is turning into a spotless mirror-like surface. But I noticed something interesting here. Check out how it crawled up and saturated the riverbank. This absolutely wouldn't happen if I primed and painted the ground, as it would create a protective barrier. I mean, it's not a bad thing, but worth pointing out. But that's not all. Bubbles started forming seemingly out of nowhere. Okay, it wasn't from nowhere. They were coming from the bottom. More specifically from that cracked layer of still water. And this quickly turned into a major disaster in the making. The more I kept bursting them, the more was the crack affected by the heat from the blowtorch, and it quickly turned into a chain reaction. And they just kept coming and forming even as the resin started to solidify. This wasn't a great feeling at all, let me tell you that. Also, the resin somehow reacted with the enamel artifacts on the hull, and some paint started to shrivel up on the side. It's interesting stuff, my dear friends. The constant heat made the resin in this area solidify pretty fast and luckily stopped the bubbling. So I was kinda able to partially sort of fill the resulting holes with some leftover epoxy I had laying in the cup. Well, with the look of complete defeat, I covered it up and left it to dry overnight. The next morning, I wasn't met with a glass-like surface as I'm used to. Not great at all, but I knew that it was all fixable. It was just unexpected and it made me big sad. F's in the chat, everyone. So I made a second batch, once again 60 milliliters in total volume, and because I needed this one to be more translucent, I added only 3 drops of paint. This pour was also easy because I could once again cover the entire surface all the way up to the side hatches on the turret. It's also pretty sweet to observe how the hull remains visible and slowly vanishes into the murky depths, isn't it? Once again, I burst the bubbles, wishing I could do something about those in the first layer, but my plan was already solid and I knew what had to be done. Cover it up once again and get back to it in the evening. And this time I was met with exactly what I was hoping for, a smooth, glass-like surface. So I quickly ripped off the tape to enjoy my resin creation in its full glory, and, as expected, no leakage or any other problems in this department. Moving on, I trimmed the sides where the resin crawled up a little, and here's why I prefer to leave the resin for about 12 hours instead of the recommended 24. It's rock hard but not brittle. So when I'm cutting the sides, it behaves more like hard rubber than resin, right? It just makes the job easier. The sides were then cleaned with lacquer thinner, which removed the tape residue, and then I gave them a generous coat of glossy varnish. Now it was time for the obligatory water gel from AK. I do love some smooth, glass-like surface. In fact, a smooth, glass-like surface and real earth from my garden, trademark, are my two favorite things in this hobby. But a rippled water surface just looks a bit more authentic. I've seen your feedback on my previous epoxy resin waters, and learning from it, I decided to keep the ripples rather subtle. Here's a heavy conspiracy theory. The Panzer of the Lake wasn't in an actual lake, it was in a river. But even a river can flow calmly with a rather smooth water surface, so I ended up with two very thin coats of diluted water gel, and I applied it not in the form of waves, but rather stippling it for those round, uneven water ripples. I also covered the sides for an even smoother, glossier result. And once it was dry, it was time to deal with those bubbles. I brushed a thin layer of diluted still water over the entire surface and sprinkled tiny amounts of natural scatter and some laser cut leaves on the surface. This way, most of them won't get soaked with acrylic water and they'll keep their natural, vivid colors. If they got completely soaked, they'd turn dark and glossy, and that wouldn't be very nice. Also, still water is great for leveling out the surface. For example, I found the ripples a little too aggressive, although I tried really hard, but this step made the water surface look calmer. You just learn something new with every diorama. The final component is the figure. Here I decided to try a slightly different approach than usual, and instead of my traditional black and white pre-shading, I went with mahogany brown and deck tan pre-shading. It was suggested to me several times that warmer colors would result in a more natural looking result on the painted figure. The rest was painted with the usual glazing method. It's all about painting the surface in several completely translucent layers of paint, letting the previous work create shadows and highlights. However, I found the contrast to be rather weak, so maybe a combination of black and deck tan on the next figure would hit that sweet spot. Then I usually outline every seam line and detail with black-brown color. This is not a clean job, so I like to do it early and fix it later with highlights. What I don't usually do is accentuate the shadows because the black coat does a pretty good job with that, but here dark brown wasn't sufficient. Highlights, that's the usual stuff as always. I only use one very strong color and add a good amount of paint drying retarder, which helps with those smooth color transitions without visible tide marks. My final touch is picking out details such as pockets and so on with an even brighter color. This one has to stand out really strongly. It adds that final bit of crisp detail to the figure. Smaller details such as shoes, belts, holsters and so on are easier to paint with the old school method, aka building up the lights with a paintbrush. For this, the black-brown undercoat works like a dream, and this is where I learned to appreciate this method. So that's the finished figure. As one of my friends said, the way I paint figures is not perfect, but it makes sense because the results are good enough for diorama purposes, especially if we consider the speed and cadence I need to maintain. So yeah, he summed it up perfectly. Also, I love this figure's expression, he's like Dwayne Johnson when he does that eyebrow trick. And I also tried painting his watch. So I could superglue him to his honorable position on the riverbank and finish the diorama by painting the wooden sides with a thick coat of flat black Tamiya paint. And here we go, my friends, another water diorama in the books, or should I say in my display case. Pro tip, if you don't want the glass shelves in your display cases to be dusty, just make lots of epoxy resin water dioramas and they'll nicely catch all the dust, leaving your shelves clean. Anyway, I wanted to make this scene for a while, I just wasn't able to copy the historical photo turned meme into, an exact replica in 3 dimensions. But on the other hand, that wasn't my goal either, because I usually like to get inspired by photos and try capturing their essence, if that makes sense. Also, it was impossible to find a figure that would match the soldier in the picture, but I believe this one fits the scene even better. After all, I'm sure many soldiers would come to the Panzer of the Lake and ask for its wisdom. So, what are your favorite Panzer of the Lake memes? Post them in the comments, okay? One of the suggestions I saw in the comments was that I made a lot of dioramas using the same color palette, and a change of season would be nice. So it made me think, and because it's the middle of summer, the next project will be all about winter. And it's gonna be a pretty small model, so it should be quite fun. At least I hope it will. Anyway, thank you for watching, my friends, and thank you to my awesome patrons who make this show possible. If you like what I'm doing, wanna get more of it, and in return support my work, you can go to my Patreon page and see what kind of reward would you like. I'm posting there almost every day with updates from my workbench. We can get in touch through DMs, comments, and emails. I'm posting 1 week early ad-free videos, so you could, hopefully, watch the next one right now. I also have some small 3D models for detailing your models in dioramas, a bunch of references from the real world if you need inspiration for old buildings, landscapes, and so on, and these beautiful studio photos which you can download in full resolution. So, yeah, okay, my friends, this entire scene took me a little over a week to finish, and if it wasn't for that overly complicated model, it would be done even faster. But hey, as long as it's finished and it's not a total failure, then who am I to complain? So it's time to clean my workbench once again and make it messy in like 5 minutes. And you all stay safe, stay awesome, build your models, don't just collect them, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!